The prison warden told Johnny Cash he'd never return. He sang anyway. The warden's office was smaller than people imagine. Just 4 walls, a desk, and 2 chairs facing each other across worn linoleum that had seen decades of bad news delivered in measured tones. Johnny Cash sat in one of those chairs in 1968, hands folded, expression unreadable. The warden sat across from him, a stack of papers between them that neither man had touched yet. Outside, 200 inmates waited in a cafeteria that doubled as a performance hall. They'd been told Johnny Cash was coming. They'd been counting days. The warden spoke first, his voice administrative, final. "We can't allow it." Johnny didn't move, didn't argue, just let the silence stretch long enough that the warden felt compelled to explain himself. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe some moments define more than careers, consider subscribing. We're building something different here. This was Cummins Prison Farm in Arkansas. Not the kind of place that made headlines unless something went very wrong. Medium security, work farm, men serving time for things society preferred not to think about once the cell doors closed. Johnny Cash had played prisons before, Folsom, San Quentin, places where his name alone carried weight, where the performances became legend before they even ended. But Cummins was different. There were rumors, whispers that had made it beyond the walls, stories about men who disappeared into the fields and never came back, about discipline that crossed lines no official report would ever acknowledge, about graves in the woods that the state didn't keep records of. Arkansas officials denied everything, called it exaggeration, said former inmates had scores to settle and reputations to rebuild. Johnny had heard the stories. He'd also heard from people he trusted, people who'd worked inside these systems, who knew the difference between prison yard mythology and something darker. He'd agreed to perform at Cummins anyway, not despite the rumors, because of them. The prison administration was thrilled. A Johnny Cash concert meant good press, rehabilitation narratives, a chance to show the public that Cummins was just another correctional facility doing difficult work with dignity. Then Johnny submitted his set list. Most of it was standard, the songs people expected. Folsom Prison Blues, I Walk the Line, songs about consequence and survival that felt appropriate for the setting. But buried in the middle was a song the warden's office had never heard before. It was called The Wall. Johnny had written it specifically for this performance. It wasn't on any album, wouldn't be released commercially for years. The lyrics were direct, unflinching. They spoke about men buried in unmarked graves, about violence dressed up as discipline, about silence that protected the powerful and erased the powerless. The song named no names, made no specific accusations, but everyone who heard it would know exactly what Johnny Cash was talking about. And more importantly, they'd know he'd stood in front of Arkansas corrections officials and sung it anyway. That's why Johnny was sitting in the warden's office 20 minutes before showtime, listening to a man with institutional authority explain why The Wall couldn't be performed. The warden wasn't angry. That would have been simpler. He was reasonable, measured. He laid out his concerns the way administrators do when they've already made their decision but need to make it sound collaborative. "Mr. Cash, we appreciate what you're trying to do here, we really do, but this song, it references allegations that have been thoroughly investigated, allegations that were found to be without merit." Johnny still hadn't spoken. He'd learned a long time ago that silence made people uncomfortable enough to keep talking. These men, the warden gestured vaguely toward the cafeteria, they're here because they made choices, bad choices, and part of rehabilitation is helping them take responsibility, not feeding into grievances, not encouraging them to see themselves as victims of a system that's trying to help them. There was a pause, the kind that demands response. Johnny finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "How many of those men out there have families coming to visit this month?" The warden blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Families, wives, kids, parents? How many visitors are scheduled? I don't have those numbers in front of me. Guess. The warden shifted. Maybe 20%. 30 at most. These men are serving long sentences. Families move on. Johnny nodded slowly. So 70–80% of them, nobody's coming? Nobody's checking? Nobody's asking questions? Mr. Cash, which means if something happened to one of them, if somebody got hurt worse than the paperwork said, or if somebody didn't make it out of a situation they should have walked away from, who'd know? Who'd push back? The warden's expression hardened. That's exactly the kind of irresponsible speculation. I'm not speculating. I'm asking who'd know. Because from where I'm sitting, the answer seems to be nobody would know. Nobody who mattered. Nobody who could do anything about it. What do you do in that moment, when you're facing institutional power, when every reasonable voice would tell you to compromise, to pick your battles, to remember that you're a guest here? If you've ever stood at that crossroads, or wondered if you would, leave a comment. I'd like to know. The warden leaned forward. Let me be very clear. If you perform that song, this will be your last performance in an Arkansas correctional facility, possibly your last in any state facility. There will be consequences. Johnny met his eyes. I appreciate you being honest about that. So you'll remove it from the set? No, sir, I won't. The warden's jaw tightened. Then we're done here. Not quite. Johnny stood, but didn't move toward the door. Those men out there, they were told I was coming. They've been waiting. Some of them probably haven't had anybody show up for them in years. So I'm going to walk out there and perform. And if you want to stop me, you're welcome to try. But you'll have to do it in front of them. Johnny Cash walked into that cafeteria 10 minutes later with his guitar and June Carter at his side. The inmates erupted. Not polite applause, the kind of noise that comes from men who've been counting hours until something breaks the routine of institutional time. The warden stood against the back wall, arms crossed, flanked by two corrections officers whose expressions said they'd been briefed on what was about to happen. Johnny performed the first half of his set like nothing had happened. Folsom Prison Blues brought the room alive. I Walked the Line pulled them into something quieter, more introspective. Then he paused, adjusted his guitar, looked out at 200 men who'd probably heard every promise and platitude the system could offer. I wrote something for you all, he said. It's called The Wall. The room went silent in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet, anticipatory, tense. And Johnny sang. The lyrics cut through that cafeteria like a blade. Direct language about men who'd been erased, about violence that never made reports, about graves that official records didn't acknowledge. Nobody moved. Not the inmates, not the guards, not the warden. June Carter stood beside Johnny, her presence a quiet defiance of its own, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this choice. When Johnny finished, there was a beat of absolute silence. Then the applause started. Not loud at first, just one man. Then another. Then the whole room, building it as something that wasn't just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition, validation. The sound of men who'd been told their stories didn't matter, hearing someone with a platform say, I believe you, and I'm willing to risk something to say it out loud. The warden didn't move from his position against the wall, didn't stop the performance, didn't intervene. Because Johnny had been right about one thing. Stopping him in front of those men would have created exactly the kind of incident the administration wanted to avoid. So the warden stood there and watched Johnny Cash finish his set, knowing that the song would spread, that inmates would talk, that the rumors would gain new life with Johnny's name attached to them. And there was nothing he could do about it except make good on his promise about consequences later. If what Johnny did here moves you, if you believe some stands matter even when they're quiet, hit that subscribe button. Not for algorithms, for the stories that deserve to be remembered. Johnny Cash never performed in another Arkansas state facility. The band wasn't official, nothing was put in writing, but every time his team reached out about scheduling, there were complications, scheduling conflicts, security concerns, vague administrative pushback that never quite crystallized into a refusal they could challenge. Other states took notice too. Not all of them, but enough. Prison performances became more complicated, more restricted, more conditional. Johnny kept doing them anyway, but the rooms got smaller, the permissions harder to secure. The Wall was never released as a single. It appeared on a live album years later, buried deep in the track listing, where casual listeners might miss it. The performance at Cummins was never recorded, at least not officially. There's rumor of a tape somewhere, passed between collectors, but nothing verified. Arkansas eventually acknowledged the Cummins abuses, not because of Johnny's song, not directly, but because enough attention accumulated over time that investigations became unavoidable. Mass graves were found, exactly where former inmates had always said they were. Disciplinary practices that violated every standard of humane incarceration were documented. Officials were reprimanded. Some lost their jobs. Reforms were implemented. And somewhere in the long chain of attention that made those reforms possible, there was a man with a guitar who'd stood in a cafeteria and sung a song everyone told him not to sing. Did the Wall change everything? No. One song doesn't dismantle institutional power, but it changed something. It told 200 men that somebody with a platform believed them, that their stories weren't just prison yard mythology, that silence wasn't the only option. And it demonstrated, to them and to everyone watching, that Johnny Cash's rebellion wasn't about spectacle or defiance for its own sake. It was about using whatever power you had, however small, to stand with people who had none. Even when it cost you something, especially when it cost you something. If this story reminded you why some voices matter more than their volume, hit that like button. And if you believe these moments belong in memory, not in silence, leave a comment. What would you have done in that warden's office? I genuinely want to know. This wasn't just about a song. It was about the choice between comfort and conscience, between access and integrity, between performing for people and standing with them. Johnny Cash walked into Cummins Prison Farm knowing exactly what he'd lose. He sang anyway. Not because he thought one song would tear down walls, but because some silences are more dangerous than the consequences of breaking them. Thanks for watching. If this story mattered to you, subscribe. Share it with someone who'd understand why. And remember, the most important stands aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're just a man, a guitar, and the decision not to look away.